Can I dance with your son? The question was so small it might have been lost in the city noise, except that it landed right between Ricardo's watch and his windshield, in a place where he had stopped measuring time and started measuring outcomes. He looked down. A little girl, barefoot, skirt patched at the hem, held out half of a warm cocina wrapped in grease-marked paper. Her eyes were earnest and persistent, the kind children have when they mean something that adults have forgotten to want. Ricardo's first instinct was to move on. Meetings waited. His phone buzzed in his pocket like a tiny, demanding drum. His suit was still dust-free from the valet. His coffee in a biodegradable cup was untouched. His son, Tomás, sat in the passenger seat, restless with a tablet in a soft, bored grin, used to being handed attention in measured portions. "Can I dance with your son?" the girl repeated, softer this time, as if the word dance were more fragile than the shreds of her shoeless foot. Her offer hovered between them, half of a crisp, salty snack and an invitation that carried a dozen meanings. To a child it was literal, a wish to join the small circle of someone else's life for a moment. To Ricardo it felt like a test. To Tomás it was a possible adventure. To the girl, then, the offer of her snack was an exchange, an honest trade, a little covenant, something to eat in return for being allowed into another world for the length of a song. He could have said no. He could have tossed coins and left. He could have pretended he didn't hear, leaned on the luxury of his haste and the armor of indifference that had been useful so far. Instead, he unbuckled his seatbelt. The cocina was warm and oily between small fingers. When he took it, he noticed the smell first. Fried dough, a hint of spiced chicken, the way cheap street snacks announce themselves to the world. He handed half to Tomás without thinking. The boy looked at the crumb-strewn napkin, then at the girl's knees, and without a lecture, stood and took her by the gloved hand of his childish courage. They danced there, in a parking lot that cut across two neighborhoods. It was nothing choreographed. Tomás shuffled awkwardly, his sneakers humming on asphalt. Helena pivoted on bare soles, pulling at the corner of her skirt in a way that made Ricardo's scrot tighten. People looked. A woman at the crosswalk smiled with tempered curiosity. Marcelo, Ricardo's partner, kept his phone pressed to his ear and a frown between his brows. He watched with that precise, business-like suspicion that weighs risk more heavily than humanity. It took less than a minute. Tomás and Helena spun in a small, private orbit. For Ricardo, the timepiece on his wrist ticked and felt suddenly ridiculous. He had arranged strategy meetings, closed funding rounds, overseen product launches that promised to streamline the lives of millions.
Yet the most human thing he had done that week had been an automatic reply to a shareholder email. When they stopped, Helena, who was only 6, extended the other half of her snack to him with both hands, like an offering. "For you," she said. There was something deliberate in that small ritual. She had not begged for money. She had not asked for a gadget or a promise to change the world. She had asked permission to be seen, and offered what little she owned as proof she meant it. Ricardo thought of the way his own daughter used to insist on splitting an apple with him in the mornings, how those routine flares of connection had cooled after the divorce in the long hours. He tasted the coxinha, cheese and spice and a bitter, sudden nostalgia, and he felt a kernel of something hard inside him give way. If you'd asked him later what moment changed him, he would point to that small exchange, the salt on his tongue and the look in a girl's eyes. He would say it felt less like saving and more like being found. "Thank you," he said to Helena, and he meant it. Tomás squeezed her hand before sliding back into the car. Marcelo closed his laptop with a soft, disapproving clack. "Don't make a spectacle," Marcelo muttered as Ricardo opened the door to let them in. "We have investors waiting." Ricardo smiled without humor. "We made room," he said, and the words surprised him with their warmth. Ricardo's world was built on sleek lines and efficiency. His company's lobby smelled faintly of citrus polish. Elevators glided like thought experiments. There were glass panes and an executive calendar that insisted on clarity. Call at 9, pitch at 10, lunch at noon. He lived in a white apartment where every chair had a purpose, and every painting had been curated to signal taste without sentiment. Even his grief had been made efficient. Divorce papers filed, custody negotiated, memories compartmentalized into folders on a hard drive labeled personal. Yet that afternoon, The sound of Helena's bare feet on asphalt had pulled one of those folders open and spread out a page he had not intended to read. He found in the margins an absence he couldn't schedule away, the absence of small, unprogrammed presence. He had perfected outcomes for other people's problems and outsourced his own sorrow to hard work. Across a canal and under a bridge a few blocks from his office, Helena's life was measured in different terms. Her world had a different kind of economy, one made of scraps and recipes, of mornings counted by whether someone had enough to eat, of old newspapers wrapped around schoolbooks that only sometimes saw daylight. Dona Nusa, Helena's grandmother, kept a rhythm. She'd wake at dawn, stoke a small stove, prepare fried snacks to sell near the bus stop, and stitch torn hems by lamplight. She had been a cook for decades in various canteens, and at times worked in some respectable kitchens before life narrowed her options.
Her hands were skilled and steady. Her back had memorized the bend of life's chores. They slept under a tarpaulin tied to a concrete pillar, a small kingdom ruled by the logic of survival and mutual protection. Dona Nesa taught Helena how to fold an empty carton into something like a cradle. She taught her the names of spices and the sound of a pot when it was hot enough to start the dough. Helena had learned to treasure one thing above everything, a single kukshina she earned by helping one morning and kept for later as a talisman. It was the sort of thing a child saves because it represents possibility, the hope that life might offer more than the day's bare necessities. When Helena left their shelter that afternoon, she had the kukshina tucked into the pocket of her skirt like a small secret son. She had practiced the dance in the motion of her hands all the way to the parking lot. For her, the request to dance was not a performance or an exploit. It was a bid for belonging. It was how she asked to be known for a moment as someone who could be included in a child's life without cost. Dona Nesa watched the exchange from a distance, both proud and wary. She'd been a cook. She knew the dignity of food and the bargaining power of sharing it. She had also seen kindness morph into drama. She kept her hands folded, sleeves pulled over her wrists, letting Helena live the small bravery of the moment. When Ricardo offered blankets later, she accepted with the same practicality she approached recipes: measure, test, then decide. The city, meanwhile, moved without concern. Buses hissed. A dog threaded carefully around cardboard boxes. Inside a spotless car, Ricardo put a napkin over the crumbs they had gathered and told himself he would not let this go unnoticed. He did not let it go unnoticed. That night, the apartment felt too quiet. The white walls reflected the streetlight in angles that made him aware of how precise everything had become. He lay awake, turning the day over like a small coin, tasting the kukshina again as if memory could be a flavor. He called no meetings. He opened a notebook and wrote a single sentence in the margin: "Go back." By morning, his steps had weight. He found himself in the shopping district before the city fully woke, buying thermals and a bulky fleece blanket that smelled faintly of detergent, the sort of item that announces itself loudly and clearly as help. He thought of the small, practical things he could do: a blanket, a hot meal, a way to secure shelter for a night. But the moment he imagined helping, he also imagined resistance, legal concerns, optics, the murmur of investors who prefer charity to messy human entanglement. Marcelo's voice came to him the instant he told his partner on the phone: "We can seed a foundation, Ricardo. We can fund programs professionally, but you know we can't just hire people arbitrarily. We have policies."
"You sound like HR," Ricardo said, and then he realized he was talking to the man who kept their balance sheet steady. Marcelo clicked his tongue. "I'm saying, think about consequences, PR, precedent. You can be generous without restructuring the company around your personal impulses." Ricardo knew Marcelo was right in spirit. He also knew the difference between philanthropy from a safe distance and presence. Presence meant being there when the messy, human parts of life surfaced, when paperwork was insufficient, when you needed to hold a child's hand through an illness, when you needed to show up for a grandmother who had never before been offered dignity without strings. He called Silvana, the HR manager, a woman with a practical smile and a notebook full of checklists. Silvana had earned her place by navigating labor law and courtesy with equal skill. She had an almost maternal firmness when it came to policy. Rules were not obstacles to kindness, she would say, but frameworks that made help sustainable. "Hi, Ricardo," she answered on the third ring. "Everything all right?" He told her the story in brief: the girl, the dance, the cocina. He told her the part he could not explain, how taking that half of a snack felt like an answer to a private account he had to settle. Silvana listened. The sound of her pen on paper was a steady rhythm in his ear. "If you want to help, we have to keep it within company policy," she said. "We can hire Dona Nelsa on a temporary contract. We can set up a payroll, background checks, of course. There are processes for enrolling a child in school we might assist with, but we'll need consent and paperwork." "I'll sign," Ricardo said. "Whatever you need, do it." Silvana hesitated, not out of suspicion, but out of caution. "I'll need to confer with legal, and Marcelo should be in the loop. This will require approval at executive level. We'll need to think about scope." "I know," Ricardo said. "Start the conversation. Tell me what to sign." It was a small administrative moment and a seismic one. Ricardo's impulse had found a channel that would force the messy details into order. He was not bypassing policy. He was inviting policy to do its care work. He showed up at the viaduct that afternoon with 2 blankets and a packet of spare change for the stove. Helena met him at the same place, mud still under her toenails, eyes cautious but curious. Dona Nesa stood behind her, arms folded like a defense and a shield. "Don't get used to being freckled by strangers," she said dryly, and then, softer, "But if you brought blankets, that won't go to waste." Ricardo handed them over. The blankets were heavy and smelled like washed wool. Dona Nesa inspected them as if they were ingredients, measuring their usefulness. Helena handed him a folded scrap of paper she had pressed into her pocket, a drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands, one labeled Tomás, the other Helena.
There was a sun above them, and the coccinea drawn with too many tiny dots. Ricardo pressed his thumb against the paper and felt its jagged edges. When he took the paper, Elena stuck her free hand into his and tugged, almost pulling him down into her small, immediate gravity. "Will you come tomorrow?" she whispered. He promised he would. That promise, he understood, costs less money than reputation, but it cost him attendance. It meant he would have to be present beyond the public gesture. He would have to keep showing up. "Okay," he said. "I'll come." Back at the office, the system woke slowly to the fact of a new commitment. Ricardo's mention of a girl and her grandmother traveled through channels: an email, a Slack message, a surprised emoji. Marcelo's eyebrows knitted together into a ledger of concerns. He dialed Ricardo in his office, the city visible in a sheet of light behind him. "You're really doing this?" Marcelo asked, not masking skepticism with much success. "Yes," Ricardo replied. "You know investors only tolerate certain types of risk." "I'll accept the risk," Ricardo said. "We'll do it properly, with HR, with legal, no shortcuts." Marcelo exhaled like someone removing a splinter. "You're mixing personal life with company resources? You think employees will be comfortable with that? What about compensations? Are you planning to set up a private arrangement through the foundation?" "I want Dona Nelsa to lead food services for a pilot program, canteen-style, low-cost meals for employees who need them," Ricardo said. "I'll fund it, but I also want her to have a contract, to be on payroll, to have dignity in the arrangement." Silence followed. Ricardo could nearly feel the shift in the office's atmosphere, the hum of productivity punctured by a human request. Marcelo's response was careful, the same measured caution he used when arguing policy in board meetings. "You'll have pushback," Marcelo warned, "from investors, from some of the staff, but if you want to do it, if you're willing to sign the approvals, I'll steer the optics. We can make it a CSR initiative, tie it to our community program, if you say so." Ricardo's answer was immediate: "Do it." Marcelo's voice softened in that second. "All right, but Ricardo, keep me looped in, for everyone's sake." Ricardo hung up and then called Silvana back. He outlined the plan: a months-long pilot, a contract for Dona Nelsa, a small room converted into a kitchen annex and a safe place for Elena to rest, school assistance via a local NGO he would fund, daily visits, and a stipend that would cover basics for 3 months. He stressed that everything would be official, no fast lanes, no headline-grabbing theatrics. Silvana typed and asked pragmatic questions: work permits, certifications, liability. She asked about the role. Would Dona Nelsa be staff or a contracted vendor? She suggested training and a probationary period, mentioned hygiene rules and fire codes. Ricardo listened to the list and realized, with a clarity that startled him, how much he had taken for granted. He had been used to signing checks and directing people. Now he needed processes. That detail humbled him in a way checks never could. "There will be paperwork," Silvana said. "There will be training. We'll run background checks. If you're willing to fund training and oversee the space, I'll draft documents and get legal involved." "Get legal involved," Ricardo said. "And Marcelo." Silvana made a small, business-like sound. "I'll start this afternoon." Preparations began in a language Ricardo had not spoken in years, the language of details. He learned the names of forms. He sat through meetings with legal counsel who asked about liability and indemnity. He walked through the potential kitchen space, a storage room repurposed at the edge of the cafeteria, a narrow slab of a place with a sink and a single plug, and imagined it alive with steam and laughter. He thought of ovens warming on winter mornings, of impoverished employees finding a hearty meal at minimal cost, of a grandmother teaching a workforce about food made with care. Marcelo presented projections, cost centers, expected uptake, break-even points. He was helping in his way. The spreadsheets comforted him. Human need had taken a column in a budget, and from there it could be measured, improved, and scaled. That soothed the part of Ricardo that liked to see things optimized. Silvana, for her part, was a mixture of pragmatism and restraint. "We'll need to make sure Donna Neza's rights are protected," she said. "We'll offer a 3-month contract to start. If both sides agree, we can move to indefinite employment. We'll also need to set up a small room for Helena. Cannot enroll a child in school without a guardian. If you plan to provide shelter, there are child welfare guidelines we need to respect. I'll find a partner NGO for enrollment assistance." Ricardo nodded and allowed the word partner to root in his thoughts. He did not want to be the man who parachuted kindness. He wanted partnership, sustainability. He felt the impulse to solve everything fade into the longer, more disciplined task of creating space where a child and a grandmother could be seen and respected by processes rather than rescued by spectacle. When they cleared the legalities, Silvana left with a file and a directness that made crew leaders in a war room look indulgent. Marcelo watched it all with a guarded expression. The office hummed with peculiar energy. People peered at the unusual list of supply orders appearing in procurement. Comments floated in Slack about potential press, some worried, some curious. There was more to do than legal forms. The city that afternoon felt like a tapestry woven from people's biographies. Ricardo hired a small NGO liaison to help with school enrollment and social services.
A contractor measured the tiny storage room and quoted a realistic price for ventilation and a second-hand stove. He authorized the payment and felt his satisfaction measured in the dull satisfaction of concrete things purchased for the right reasons. He returned to the viaduct with a new determination. Helena ran toward him with the speed of a child who believed in the earnestness of adults when they promised. Her skirt swirled and there was a kiss of dust in the air. She pressed both hands to his cheeks and declared in grave earnest that she had taught Tomás a new step, and that when they danced again, they'd use a clap that made the sky laugh. Donna Nelsa had warmed to the idea of work with the same practical curiosity she applied to recipes. She asked questions, not about charity, but about compensation, about hours, about ingredients, and whether she could source some of them from local markets she trusted. This was not gratitude. This was negotiation for dignity, and Ricardo found himself admiring her clarity. "We'll need to get you some aprons," he said, smiling at the idea of her behind a stove in a building she had likely only seen from the distance of a bus window. Donna Neza's laugh was like a soft chime. "Ah, aprons. I have many pockets in them. I keep notes, little recipes, things that remind me of the time." Ricardo watched the move. He noticed for the first time how well creased her hands were, how confidently she measured distance with a glance. He thought of how many times he had outsourced direction to others and left the human decisions to machines. Now he wanted to learn from someone whose economy was measured in the heat of a pan and the patience of kneading dough. Helena pressed her half-eaten coxinga into his hand again. "For the kitchen," she said, solemn, "so the kitchen knows how to share." He pocketed the greasy napkin like a relic and felt an odd swell in his chest. It was not the closure of a deal. It was the opening of a door he had kept latched for years. Word of the pilot spread quietly. The company's cafeteria manager, a woman named Lucia who had worked there for 12 years, came to measure the storage room and asked practical questions about sanitation and shifts. She found herself unexpectedly excited by the prospect of handmade food grounded in a grandmother's recipes. Lucia imagined employees queuing with reusable plates, not for novelty, but for comfort. She liked the idea of someone cooking with the careful hands of someone who had learned the craft by need and love. Employees who heard about the initiative reacted in small, revealing ways. A young developer sent a message with a heart emoji and an offer to help with the morning shift. A systems analyst commented about the ROI of warmer meals on productivity. Someone else wrote simply, "If it's real, I'll be first in line. Feels like home."
The response was mixed, but behind the metrics and optimistic Slack messages, there was genuine curiosity, an appetite to see the human face of a company traditionally known for its algorithms. Not everyone was pleased. A few investors asked for clarity about budget allocations. An HR analyst flagged the need for safety training. There were whispers that the initiative might create tension, that employees might resent perceived favoritism if an outsider was brought in under the founder's wing. Ricardo expected this.
He signed off on every necessary document and invited conversation. He insisted the program would be transparent, open postings for auxiliary shifts, clear contracts, and a community oversight committee. He wanted the help to be an answer, not a lever of control. Silvana did the steady work of making the impulse legitimate. She drafted the contract for Dona Nusa, scheduled training sessions, and coordinated with the NGO to verify Alina's age and residency. She asked practical questions about schooling options and equity of services. She was, in short, the bureaucratic muscle that turned empathy into a process. There was pushback in quieter forms, a tense lunch with Marcelo in which he asked if the move might distract from Q3 goals, a terse email from legal about compliance concerns, but Ricardo found he could absorb the friction by treating it as part of a larger task, something to be balanced rather than avoided. He had always been comfortable with complexity. Now he found complexity that demanded not optimization, but patience. On a bright morning, the storage room had been painted a warm yellow. A borrowed stove sat in one corner, small and honest. The contractor had hung curtains to hide a patchwork of stored office supplies. Someone had donated mismatched plates and a worn kettle. There was a long folding table where, in a few days, ladles would stand ready and the smell of fried dough would drift into the building like a new hymn. Alina stood at the lip of that room, palms clammy, watching the bustle. Tomás sat beside her on a crate, legs swinging. He had decided, without parental directive, to bring his skateboard that day. He seemed proud to carry the weight of a new responsibility, to help a friend feel like a guest in his world. Dona Nusa inspected the makeshift kitchen with a professional eye, her expressions moving from assessment to appeasement. She nodded at the kettle, smiled at the small stove's reliability, and at one point she ran a thumb along the counter and made a soft sound that meant approval. It was the same noise she made when a stew finally reached the right flavor. Ricardo watched from the doorway, hands in his pockets, feeling conspicuously human. Marcelo hovered a few yards away, arms folded. "You're sure about this?" Marcelo asked again, though with less edge in his voice now. The financial case and the optics were being smoothed.
Marcelo was pragmatic about demands being integrated into the company flow. "I think so," Ricardo said. He thought of the napkin in his wallet and the stick figures Elena had drawn. He thought, too, of the hollow that had been in his own life, a hole of absence he had coated with success. He felt at last that filling it would mean more than buying another property or flying to another conference. It would mean learning how to be present in small, daily ways. "Then let's do it right," Marcelo said. "We'll write the proposal as a community program. We'll set measurable outcomes. You're funding it, I'll manage the rollout." Ricardo nodded. It was an imperfect victory. It would generate emails and debates, but it would also put Dona Nusa in a kitchen with a contract and Elena in a classroom with a backpack. It would place dignity in forms that could sustain a life. They walked back toward the viaduct together once more. Elena greeted them like a captain greeting land, a small, fierce presence that changed the scale of things. She pressed a second, newly made cocina into Ricardo's hand like a benediction. "For the office," she said, "so everyone remembers the way we shared." He laughed, surprised at how much that sentence satisfied him. Sharing, in Elena's world, was not about charity, but about the ethics of relationship. He understood that finally, it seemed, he had been invited into a practice rather than a moment. As they left, Elena tugged Tomás's sleeve and asked, earnest and unembarrassed, "When will you teach me to dance with two hands?" Tomás beamed. "Tomorrow." Ricardo walked away with the weight of a new schedule in his chest. There would be meetings, of course, follow-ups, budget reviews, the inevitable memos. There would be work to do to make this sustainable. There would also be small things, the sound of frying oil, the sight of aprons, the letters from school. The project would insist on daily presence rather than the spectacular. He returned to his office and sat at his desk. The city below was the same city it had always been, urgent, indifferent, brilliant in its capacity to keep moving. But for the first time in a long while, Ricardo felt obligated not only to the quarterly numbers, but to the small, unfolding lives that had chosen to intersect with his. The feeling was both humbling and electric. He opened his calendar and booked the afternoon for a meeting that would require both legal and HR. He wrote a note at the top of the invite: Pilot, Community Kitchen,
Elena and Donanusa, support plan. He attached a copy of the proposed contract and a list of items the NGO recommended for school enrollment. Then he did something he hadn't allowed himself in years. He canceled a non-essential strategy call and bought a pair of sturdy shoes for Tomás that he hoped might someday be lent to another child. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a sequence of small choices he had decided to honor.
There were moments in the coming days where uncertainty threaded through the work. An investor asked for a briefing on the community program's governance. A legal clerk requested proof of residency. An employee wrote to HR to ask whether hiring someone's relative should go through an open application process. Each of these formalities mattered. Each demanded a careful reply. Silvana remained the center of this procedural gravity. She convened a meeting with legal and procurement and came back with a list of requirements and a calm set of priorities. "We'll run the contract for a paid pilot," she said. "We'll confirm the NGO's recommendation for school enrollment. We'll arrange space for Helena 2 hours a day at first for assessments. If she needs more time, we'll discuss." Papers were printed. Forms were signed. The language was precise and careful. Ricardo watched as bureaucracy translated compassion into an accountable structure. It was less romantic than simply handing over a check, but it felt real. On the third day, a photographer, sent by the company's internal comms team, showed up to document the kitchen progress. Ricardo hesitated. He had no desire for a press moment. Silvana, always pragmatic, insisted the documentation was for internal transparency, to prevent rumors and to ensure accountability. She framed the pictures as records, not celebrations. Helena watched the camera with a child's curiosity. She peered into the lens as if it were a magic window, and for the first time since Ricardo had met her, she seemed to understand that her small life was now recorded in ways that might outlast her. She didn't ask for anything in return. She only offered the cameraman the half of the cochinilla she had left and a shy, trusting smile. The image of her, small and earnest, holding out food as a currency of trust, would later become a quiet emblem among the staff. But at that moment, it was just between them, the girl and the man who had chosen to step off the schedule and into a rhythm that began with presence. The room that had been storage now carried the scent of frying oil and lemon scrub. Lucia practiced a menu line with Donanusa, potatoes roasted in garlic, a simple stew, the cochinilla reproduced in generous, honest batches. Tomás swept the floor awkwardly, proud to help. Marcelo came by with a box of protective gloves and an expression somewhere between investor and godfather. He watched Donanusa move, and for the first time in a long career showed something close to admiration. "You really know your way around a pan," he said, then quickly added, "in a way the rest of us don't." Donanusa shrugged. "You learn at the elbow of life," she said. "You learn what keeps people warm." Ricardo realized then that the pilot would not be about him. He could fund the project, pull strings, arrange meetings, but at the center of it must be skill and care. People like Donanusa who turned basic ingredients into sustenance and relationship. If it stayed about him, it would collapse the moment the headlines moved on. If it became about them, it might last. "We'll support you," he told Donanusa, and he meant it with a clarity he had not expected to feel so soon. She nodded, not as someone accepting charity, but as someone setting terms. "We will cook," she said, "and we will teach. And if the children come, I will teach them a step that keeps them standing." The story was only beginning. Promises had been made on more than one side. Papers were in motion. A small room had been converted into a kitchen and into possibility. There were still obstacles, legal approvals, investor memos, staff questions, the practicalities of schooling. There were also quieter challenges, a grandmother adapting to a new environment, a child learning the discipline of regular attendance, a company converting suspicion into sustained support. Yet something had shifted. The polished surfaces of Ricardo's life had been marked now by a grease-smudged napkin tucked into his wallet. He caught himself in a quiet elevator, pulling it out and tracing the edges without thinking. On it, a small stain was the proof of an exchange that had already begun to reorder gears inside him. At the edge of the viaduct, Helena taught Tomás a new clap that sounded like rain on the tin roof. He laughed when he missed the step, and she forgave him with a kind of generosity children are born with. Donanusa watched them, and for the first time in seasons allowed herself to imagine a future where her hands were paid for the very skill that had kept her family alive. When Ricardo left them that afternoon, he walked back into a building that would now smell of garlic and frying, an ordinary scent threaded suddenly through the extraordinary. He felt a lightness that was not relief so much as alignment. His ledger now included human names, not just numbers. He would carry that feeling into meetings and into negotiations. He was changed, but the change had only just begun to ripple. If you felt something when Helena asked that tiny question, if your heart tugged at the image of a bare foot beside a polished shoe, consider subscribing. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that small, consistent acts can rearrange lives. He kept his promise to return the next day. He did not yet know how deep the obligations would go, how many hurdles would appear, or how many hearts in his company would resist or embrace the new warmth. He only knew that when a 6-year-old asked plainly and bravely if she could dance with his son, he had stopped the clock and stepped into a rhythm that would require more than money. It would require time. The paperwork and plans waited, as did a multitude of small decisions that would determine whether a pilot project matured into a lasting change or dissolved into a photo op. Ricardo sat at his desk and opened the email from legal. The subject line read, Community Kitchen Draft Contract.
He clicked. The text scrolled like a list of commitments. He signed his name under the first paragraph. Then he stood and walked to the kitchen doorway, where a pot steamed and a woman hummed a tune she'd learned in another lifetime. He listened to the sound and felt, finally, that the beating thing inside him aligned with the city's messy, generous heartbeat. The chapter was starting. The arcs were not finished. The agreements were in motion, and so was a subtler work, the slow, steady building of trust. The trial would be measured in attendance, in the dull satisfaction of paid wages, in the sound of children learning steps, in the quiet of a small room where food and dignity met. Days folded into weeks, and the pilot settled into a rhythm that surprised even its most cautious architects. What began as a single intervention, blankets, a contract, a tiny kitchen, grew into a pattern of ordinary commitments. The paperwork that once felt like an intrusion became the scaffolding that kept promises steady. Helena went to school 3 mornings a week at first. The NGO arranged for a social worker to escort her and for Donna Nesa to vouch for her attendance. Helena learned the cadence of a classroom, sitting still for 15 minutes, raising a hand, tracing letters that looked like ladders. She loved the rhythm of music class most. The teacher taught them a song about the sun, and Helena sang as if she were pulling warmth toward her. School was messy and small and real. It was not a miracle. It was a system that required regularity, signatures, and patience, but it changed how afternoons looked. Tomás began bringing a spare pencil in his backpack. He waited at the classroom door sometimes, not to watch, but to help when a zipper stuck, or when a hand trembled with a sudden shyness. The child who once carried a tablet now carried someone else's homework like it mattered. At the company, the cafeteria pilot matured into a slow human machine. The storage room still smelled of lemon scrub and oil, but now it also carried the scent of new recipes: lentils simmered with bay leaves, soft beans folded into stews, sweet puddings in small porcelain cups. Employees who had once hesitated outside the doorway found reasons to come in: a neighbor from operations who missed his mother's cooking, a junior developer who preferred lunch that reminded him of childhood. They lined up not out of charity, but for the comfort of food made by hands that knew how to feed people with attention. Employees rotated through morning shifts as volunteers. Company policy required clear roles and equal access. Silvana insisted on the rotation because she knew the power of inclusion. If everyone could participate, the kitchen would not be seen as a founder's pet project. Lucy, the cafeteria manager, taught food safety, while Donna Nesa taught seasoning, not as instruction, but as craft. She corrected a young intern's pinch of salt with the kind of authority that had been earned over decades. When someone fumbled with a ladle, she merely showed them where to hold it. There were practical training sessions, hazardous materials forms, induction meetings. It was all dull and important. It was human-scale governance. Marcelo, who had entered the project as a wary accountant of optics, changed in less theatrical ways. He began arriving earlier than necessary to check the steam vents. He learned which pots needed a longer simmer. His emails became less clipped. One morning, Ricardo found him standing at the pass, a plate in hand, watching how Donna Nusa folded dough. When he realized Marcelo had been paying attention, Ricardo felt a small, quiet relief. Skepticism had softened into curiosity and then into a willingness to steward. Investors sent questions, legal asked for more documentation, and HR analysts raised concerns about nepotism. Ricardo answered each concern with the patience of someone who had learned the art of endurance. He met with the investor committee and presented projected costs alongside metrics of social impact, school attendance records, employee satisfaction surveys, reduced lunchtime waste. He did not promise systemic change. He framed the program honestly, a pilot with measurable goals, an experiment in dignity that could be replicated if it worked. The Community Oversight Committee, comprised of HR representatives, a member from the NGO, and a few employees, met monthly. They took minutes, they tracked attendance, they heard stories. They also disciplined when necessary. A vendor who offered questionable supplies was dismissed. A staff member who tried to use the program for personal favor was counseled and placed on a performance plan. The committee kept the initiative accountable and rooted it in collective responsibility rather than one man's whim. Helena's growth was small and steady. She stopped coming to the viaduct with the urgency of someone who had to find a pocket of safety each afternoon. Instead, she remembered to pack a thin notebook that the NGO had given her. She traced new letters and drew a small series of pictures, stick families, a sun that grew more elaborate with each page, a row of tiny coccina she had learned to draw with an artisan's pride. Her drawings had a signature now, a single smiling face with a tiny freckle near the mouth. She signed it like she was documenting an ownership. At home, beneath the tarp that had shielded them for months, Donna Nusa slept with a different kind of care. Her back still ached at the end of a day, but she slept knowing she had a steady contract and a payer who honored the terms. She kept a small ledger, a weathered notebook where she listed ingredients and the names of those who had helped. She measured gratitude the way she measured salt, with attention. When Ricardo visited, she would not call him benefactor.
She called him Oomen ki came to sit and listen, and taught him names of spices he had never bothered to learn. That listening changed him in mannered human ways. He no longer scheduled help as an isolated act. He began to learn people's names at the company cafeteria, not the CEO's curated group, but the lines and the faces. He took time to see, not because it would make a good memo, but because he had come to enjoy noticing. He discovered that noticing is a muscle. It had to be exercised. The mural idea came from an intern who had once dreamed of being an art teacher. He suggested a wall in the lobby, a permanent record not of a single founder, but of a community. At first, the suggestion was small, a painted panel with simple images of hands and meals. Then it grew into something more communal. The company hosted a weekend workshop. Employees, neighbors from the NGO, children from Helena's class, and even a few investors came with brushes. The mural was not a PR stunt. It was messy. Someone mixed the wrong yellow and grimaced. A pot of paint spilled on sneakers. Children insisted on painting with their feet and scolded the adults for painting too carefully. It was wonderful. The mural told a humble story, a line of hands passing food, a small child dancing beside an older woman with aprons like wings. At its center, someone had painted a tiny coccina, not grand, not glorified, but honest, an icon of exchange. Above it, in simple script, the phrase read, "We are kept by what we give each other." The sentence was not an instruction, it was an observation. On unveiling day, the company lobby smelled of coffee and cinnamon. People gathered, not for speeches, but to see what the paint had become. Marcelo gave a short, awkward introduction. Silvana read the committee minutes like it was a poem. Donna Nesa stood beside Helena, apron-tied, hands still marked with flour. When Ricardo stepped forward to say a few words, he did not rehearse. He told the truth, that he had been late to know how much he could learn from ordinary hands, that he had not known how much he needed to be rescued by the small bravery of a child, that this mural was a reminder not of his generosity, but of community obligations. His voice did not shake. It steadied. After the unveiling, employees lingered around tables with small plates. Someone who had never cooked in his life told a story about how a coccina at the kitchen had warmed his memories of a mother. A developer swapped stories with a janitor. The social distance that once hummed beneath the corporate hum had softened. People exchanged recipes as if they were small confessions. If there were moments of friction, they were real and contained. A vendor tried to monetize the pilot by offering overly packaged ingredients. Procurement declined.
An employee anonymously grumbled on an internal forum about the founder's hobby, but the comment drew a long response from an operations manager who wrote about hunger and dignity and the afternoons he had stood in line for his mother's soup. The debate did not unravel the program. It refined it. There were practical reversals, too. One month, during a routine inspection, the building's safety officer raised concerns about ventilation. Work halted while a contractor installed proper exhaust systems. That pause was costly and bureaucratic, but it was also instructive. It forced everyone to recommit to standards rather than improvisation. Savannah welcomed the pause. She liked the way process tempered enthusiasm without killing it. Through it all, Helena continued to teach everyone small lessons in audacity. When a group of interns planned a charity bake sale, she insisted on contributing her own coxinhas, which she had begun to learn to shape as if forming small prayers. She measured dough with a new confidence and pinched edges with a practiced thumb. Her coxinhas were humble and filled with more than chicken. Sometimes they were filled with soft beans, sometimes with cheese she could barely afford. She gave them away freely, eyes bright, and people queued not to claim charity, but to be part of the exchange. Ricardo watched one afternoon as Helena rolled dough on a low table for a class of lunch volunteers. Tomás sat beside her and mimicked her motions, sometimes too rough, sometimes too tender. They laughed when dough stuck to the table. A systems engineer named Maria, who had once written an algorithm to optimize delivery routes, sat cross-legged on the floor and learned to flatten pastry with a bottle. The image of a director of logistics learning to use a bottle taught him as much as any keynote could. Humility can be learned at the margins. The reciprocal moments were subtle. Once, when Helena presented Ricardo with a small, hand-drawn card, scribbles turned into sentences, she had written, "For you, who came back." He read it and felt a domestic, human gratitude he had not expected. Later, after months of steady attendance, she surprised him with a small, homemade coxinha, wrapped in paper so lovingly folded, it looked like a treasure. It was her best one yet, golden, slightly irregular, the edges pinched with the care of someone practicing craft. She pressed it into Ricardo's hand with a solemnity that made his eyes sting. "This is for you," she said, "because you danced." He could not remember the last time he had received something made by another person with the express intention to honor him. The coxinha was not a currency, it was a covenant. He ate it slowly, tasting not only the food, but the way trust had been kneaded into it. The flavor was modest. The meaning was vast. That afternoon, he understood what they all had meant. The act of being seen had become reciprocal.
He had not merely offered shelter and wages, he had opened his life to being taught. The people he had initially come to help kept teaching him how to stay human within the machinery of success. Change reached beyond the kitchen. HR instituted a community leave policy that allowed employees to spend 2 mornings a month assisting in community programs without penalty. The board allocated a small annual budget for neighborhood projects. The company's values document was edited. Service became more than a tagline. A small fund was established for emergencies identified by the Community Oversight Committee. These were not grand gestures. They were practical shifts in routine and policy designed to sustain care beyond headlines. Tomás evolved too. He had been a child used to curated attention. Now he became a kind of bridge. He taught Helena to tie her shoelaces in a knot that refused to come undone. He sat with her as she practiced reading out loud, and when she misread a word, he did not correct her with impatience, but with imaginative alternatives. Their friendship was not a rescue, it was companionship. They taught each other the small etiquette of concern. The more the company integrated the pilot, the more Ricardo noticed how his own calendar softened. He continued to run the business because the company still had investors and products that needed attention, but he also reserved pockets of unscheduled time, an hour here to walk a child to school, a morning there to stand quietly in the kitchen while someone stirred. He began to measure success not only in margins, but in attendance at a mural painting day, in the number of employees who volunteered, in the way Dona Nesa's apron pockets had become small libraries of handwritten notes with recipes and human names. And then the test came. In a way Grandpa had once described simply, life will ask whether this is habit or headline. It was winter, and the city turned cold enough that tarps shivered like small birds. Helena's attendance dipped because she had a fever. The NGO flagged it. The company nurse agreed to check on her, but she needed a doctor. The NGO's clinic was booked. There was a Thursday night when the system strained.
The bus was late, the clinic closed, and the temperature fell. Ricardo was in a boardroom with investors when he received the message. He felt his chest clench with the old, efficient panic, the one that paid in adrenaline but did not solve anything. He excused himself and drove through rain and glass. He found Helena warm under 3 blankets in the small room that had become their temporary haven. She coughed, small and wet, and when she saw him, she offered a weak grin. "Can you sit?" she asked. Children ask how they have always known how to give teachers their homework, even when they are the ones who need the help. He sat and held her hand for an hour. He canceled the rest of the day's meetings. He contacted the NGO and the clinic.
He signed a check for medical expenses and for a small emergency fund the oversight committee had not yet used but had set aside as contingency. In the night, he learned the difference between responding and fixing. The clinic gave Helena a diagnosis of a respiratory infection. They prescribed medicine. The company's nurse delivered it the next morning. The small crisis tested the structures they had built. The structures held. Someone from legal had already prepared an emergency protocol for child welfare. Silvana called to confirm documentation for daycare if needed. The social worker arranged for extra monitoring. That sequence, papers, calls, presents, practical help, was not picturesque. It was the hygiene of care. It was also a lesson in how planning matters. In the weeks that followed, stories accumulated in a way that felt like a ledger of human time. An employee who had once said he would never volunteer took the morning shift after his mother fell ill. He found in the kitchen a steady routine that steadied him. A janitor started bringing a small thermos of coffee to the volunteers. An HR trainee wrote a thesis about the program's effects on empathy and error rates. A local school invited Dona Nusa to teach a cooking workshop. The children learned to shape dough and to measure kindness by the way they shared it. Nothing was perfect. There were days of exhaustion when employees complained about the extra tasks piled into their plates. There were slippery moments where the work risked becoming paternalistic. Silvana kept returning them to first principles: honesty, accountability, and reciprocity. The oversight committee convened and reminded members that dignity must be central. They rewarded job descriptions, expanded protections, clarified conflict of interest rules. Bureaucracy for once felt like ally rather than obstacle. The mural becomes a quiet landmark. Visitors stopped asking, "How did this happen?" They began to ask, "How can we do this where we are?" Other companies called. An NGO wanted to replicate the model in a small factory town. A journalist wrote a modest piece that resisted sensationalism and focused on process. Ricardo declined most interviews. He did not want the story to become about him. He wanted the work to be replicable, not performative. Months after that first dance, there was an afternoon that crystallized the arc. The company organized a small fair to celebrate the pilot's 1-year anniversary. There were booths with simple crafts, a table where children could draw, and of course, a long line for Dona Nusa's food. Helena had a small stall where she taught the other children to clap the dance Tomás had learned. She stood on a small crate and led them like the captain of a tiny ship. Her voice floated over chatter. She corrected a boy who clapped too fast and encouraged a girl whose feet flew ahead of the music. When the program leaders called Ricardo to come to the main stage, he did not think of speeches. He thought of the child who had asked him months ago and again in a life that felt long already, "Can I dance with your son?" He walked up and the crowd quieted. Employees, neighbors, donors, and Helena's classmates clustered together. Ricardo said very little. He asked instead for someone else to speak. Dona Nusa took the microphone with the steadiness that belied all she had endured. She did not talk about salvation. She spoke of work and dignity and how a recipe is a way of ordering love. She thanked people with a practical list: the contractor who fixed the vent, the nurse who came for the fever, the volunteers who showed up when numbers were low. Her voice thickened when she turned to Helena and Tomás and described, in a voice that danced between maternal pride and rare humor, how 2 children had taught a city a new step. Then it happened. Helena handed Ricardo a small, wrapped bundle. The crowd leaned forward. He unwrapped it and found a coxinha. Not exactly the first one she had shared, but a new one she had made herself, golden and proud. She had made it that morning before the fair. She had been secretive about it, but she had practiced in the kitchen at dawn when the world felt softer. She handed it like an offering. "For you," she said again, the same words, now thick with memory. He tasted it slowly, as if tasting might be a sacrament. He did not speak. When he looked up, he saw faces around him. The workers who had learned to queue for friendship, the interns who had traded code for rhythm, Marcelo with his shirt sleeves rolled up and flour on his knuckles, Silvana with a look that said the documents had been in order and the heart had not been misplaced. He understood then that the program's success was not measured only in attendance or cost savings. It was measured in shared bread and in the small changes in posture when people began to look for each other. At that moment, he felt caught in a loop he had not expected. He had started by offering presents and received presents in return. He had given blankets and contracts and found that the gifts he had wanted to bestow were reciprocated in ways he had not predicted. A child's handmade snack had become a covenant between lives. After the fair, someone suggested turning the small room into a longer-term social enterprise. The proposal was complex: a non-profit arm, training programs for local residents, partnerships with the school system. Legal scrutineered the idea. Marcelo built a phased financial model. Silvana wrote a policy that balanced labor rights with the flexibility needed for the program to serve the community. The oversight committee debated and revised. They did not rush. They wanted sustainability, not spectacle. Helena kept dancing.
She was learning that some things required patient repetition. The folding of dough, the patience of a school desk, the way relationships grow by showing up. Her drawings became more detailed, a mural with a ladder to a sun and names beneath each rung. She would give one to anyone who asked. Tomás kept his shirt with flour smudges and refused to be embarrassed by it. He had learned to like simple mornings. Ricardo, in quiet, began to alter small truths in his company. He invited an employee to serve on a hiring panel for new community coordinators. He instituted a listening hour once a month where any staff member could bring concerns without filtering. He learned how to hold discomfort without eliminating it. When he missed a meeting because he had sat in a classroom with a child who could not read a word, he stopped apologizing. He changed the language he used in board meetings to include human metrics, not to moralize, but to remind the table that the company's work existed in a social field. Not everyone applauded. There were board members who left. There were investors who pulled back. But there were others who leaned in, seeing that the company could offer both innovation and community care, without one undermining the other. There were competitors who watched and borrowed ideas. Some companies sent teams to learn. There was a small shift in the industry, like a pebble causing concentric waves. Years later, the kitchen would be many things: a training center, a small social enterprise, a hub for lunches and for learning. It would not solve poverty. It would not pretend to. But it would model a different choice: that institutions can be attentive to those at their edges, that policies exist to protect dignity, that giving can be organized with respect rather than spectacle. On an ordinary morning, Ricardo found himself standing at the viaduct again, older in ways that were not only marked by gray at the temples, but by a certain slowness of rhythm in his chest. Helena came forward, barefoot no longer. She wore small sneakers with bright laces. She handed him a small envelope. Inside was a card, painted with the mural's image, and a note in her careful, newly practiced hand. "We dance bare together." He read the words and thought of how the first question had landed between his watch and his windshield. He thought of how a child's brave ask had made him reconsider the ledger by which he had been living. He felt gratitude that did not look like a ledger entry. It uncoiled, warm and private, like bread pulled from an oven. Near the viaduct, someone had begun to clean up the area with new bins, and a woman who had once been wary now waved to Helena by name. Bits of the city rearranged around the small seed they had planted. Children who had watched the mural grew up with it as a backdrop for their lives. New apprenticeships appeared in the community program. A small local bakery that had been struggling found steady business supplying the kitchen. Economies shifted in modest ways. If you find yourself thinking this is the story of a millionaire saved by a child, the truth is more complicated. It is the story of mutual rescue. It is the story of how a decision to show up, repeated, patient, regulated by humility and cared for by policy,
can rearrange the daily life of a handful of people until those changes ripple outwards. Helena did not need saving in the way a headline might describe. She needed a partner in a city that had been indifferent. Dona Nesa did not need pity. She needed contract and respect. Ricardo did not need applause. He needed to be taught how to be present. The last image is small and domestic. Helena teaching a new volunteer how to roll dough, her hands moving with a cadence that makes sense in the world. Tomás stands off to the side, balancing a tray. Ricardo watches, with a kind of quiet that comes when someone has learned to measure life by different units: attendance, presence, trust. He bends to tie his shoe and notices a small, grease-stained napkin folded in the pocket of his jacket. He unfolds it and finds a tiny drawing of two stick figures dancing. He smiles, without need for explanation. So ask yourself, quietly, how many Helenas have you walked past? Who did you notice in a day when you could have carried on measuring outcomes? You don't need to lead a board or to sign checks to act. You can speak. You can share a meal. You can hold a child's hand for a minute. You can listen. Small, consistent acts of dignity are contagious. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs that reminder. Notice one person today. Offer what you can: time, attention, a small thing earned. It may change you more than you imagine.